By the time Margaret Calloway Harrington leaned across the spray of white peonies resting against her grandfather's mahogany casket and whispered those words into her younger sister's ear, "You were always his charity case, sweetie. The will is mine. All of it. I hope you've been saving." She had spent 38 years constructing a version of the Harrington family story in which she was the protagonist, the heir, the beloved granddaughter, the woman Edmund Harrington Sr. had spent his entire life building toward. She had told this story so many times, at so many dinners and galas and boardroom lunches, with such absolute polished conviction, that she had long since stopped being able to tell the difference between the story she had built and the truth. The truth was this: Edmund James Harrington Sr., patriarch, self-made billionaire, founder of Harrington Capital Group, steelworker's son from Pittsburgh, who had turned a two-room Midtown office in 1971 into one of the most respected private equity firms in the country, a man who had built a $342 million estate through 50 years of patient, precise, unflashy excellence, had spent the last 3 years of his life quietly and methodically ensuring that every single cent of that estate, every piece of real property, every controlling share of Harrington Capital, the Hamptons compound, the 157 penthouse on the 54th floor of one of the most expensive residential buildings in the Western Hemisphere, went to the granddaughter who had sat beside him every Sunday for 12 years. The one who had read him the Wall Street Journal when his eyesight began to fail. The one who had held his hand through 2 strokes and a cardiac bypass surgery while Margaret was in Positano, posting photographs of the Amalfi coastline to her 40,000 Instagram followers. The one who had driven up from Brooklyn 3 days before he died because his housekeeper Rosa called and said he wasn't well, and who had stayed, canceling her entire work week, sitting in the chair beside his bed in the 157 penthouse, reading him The Economist on Tuesday morning and holding his hand on Wednesday morning when his breathing changed and saying nothing at all, because she had known Edmund long enough to know that what he needed in that moment was not words. It was presence. Claire Harrington had been giving Edmund presents for 12 years. And Edmund, who had spent 50 years reading balance sheets in boardrooms and the specific involuntary signals that people send when they think no one is watching, had been watching her the entire time. He was, as his estate attorney Gerald Fitch would say at the reading of the will, thorough. He was also, as Claire would come to understand in the weeks and months that followed, something far rarer than thorough. He was fair. Margaret Harrington had no idea that any of this was coming. She stood at her grandfather's funeral in a black Chanel suit with a white camellia at the lapel and delivered a 12-minute eulogy that centered herself in nearly every paragraph. And she leaned across the casket flowers and delivered her line with the quiet, elegant cruelty that only family can truly achieve. And she smiled her beautiful, empty smile at her younger sister. And she had no idea that 48 hours earlier, a partner at a downtown estate firm had called Claire's cell phone and introduced himself as Gerald Fitch, sole attorney of record for the estate of Edmund James Harrington Sr., and had asked whether she would be available for the reading of the will the following Tuesday at 9 o'clock. He had not called Margaret. Claire had not told her this. She had simply stood at the funeral in her grandmother's pearls. Edmund had given them to her privately years ago, pressing the velvet box into her hands after Sunday dinner and saying quietly, "Your grandmother would have known exactly who you are." And she had let her sister smirk, and she had said nothing at all. If your own family spent decades treating you like an afterthought, erasing you from every photograph and every opportunity in every room that mattered, while someone else collected all the glory and all the credit, and then the most powerful person in that family spent his final years quietly, systematically making it right, would you have said something or would you have waited? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because the story of what happened inside that attorney's office on Broad Street on a Tuesday morning in October is the kind of thing that makes you believe, against every cynical instinct you have developed over the course of a life, that the truth has a way of arriving eventually. Like and subscribe before we go any further, because this one goes deep. To understand what Edmund Harrington Sr. did and why and what it cost and what it gave, you have to understand where it all began. You have to go back to the Harrington family the way it actually was. Not the way Margaret had constructed it for public consumption over 4 decades, but the raw and unglamorous and frequently unkind truth of it. Edmund had one son, Richard Harrington, and Richard was the particular kind of handsome, charming, catastrophically irresponsible man that families like the Harringtons produced with some regularity in the second half of the 20th century. Raised in wealth, educated at Exeter and then Yale, possessing a surface confidence so polished and complete that it took years, sometimes decades, for the people around him to understand that there was almost nothing underneath it. Richard married Diana Weston in 1982, a Philadelphia mainline socialite whose approach to money was architectural. She spent it the way other people design rooms, with total commitment and zero regard for structural integrity. Together they had Margaret, born in 1984, and Claire, born in 1987, and it was around Claire's birth that the Harrington family began its long, quiet fracture. The official family narrative, the one Margaret had authored and maintained, was that Claire was difficult, introverted, not particularly social, not the kind of woman who commanded rooms, who sparkled under attention, who knew how to make powerful people feel interesting. Margaret was all of those things. Margaret had been performing brilliance since she was 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table of their Westchester estate and reciting the names of every member of Congress for Edmund while he sipped his Pappy Van Winkle and smiled at her as though she were a sunrise. She had known from an age so young that the knowing was almost instinctive, that Edmund Harrington Sr. was the center of gravity in this family, and she had oriented her entire personality around him the way a satellite orients around a planet, close, constant, calculated. What Margaret had never told anyone, what she had spent decades carefully, expertly burying, was that Claire's quietness was not a character flaw. It was an adaptation, a response to growing up in a household where Margaret's cruelty was permitted, even implicitly encouraged, because it was dressed up as confidence and social aptitude and the easy dominance of a girl who simply knew how to belong. To a mother, Diana, who had decided early on that the Harrington family narrative had room for exactly one dazzling daughter, and had cast her roles accordingly and without apology. To a father, Richard, who was too occupied with his own unraveling, the drinking that began in Claire's early childhood, the bad investments that quietly hemorrhaged family money through the 90s, the affairs that eventually ended his marriage in 2001, to notice that his younger daughter was being slowly, methodically, and with great precision erased from the story of her own family. Margaret had a gift for erasure. She was surgical about it, and the surgery was so clean that for years it left no visible marks. She never screamed at Claire. She never struck her. She never delivered the kind of loud, obvious cruelty that leaves evidence. She simply made Claire disappear. From family photographs where Claire always ended up slightly out of frame, positioned in the background or cut at the edge or standing at an angle that the camera somehow never caught directly. From conversations at family dinners where Margaret spoke over her so smoothly and so consistently that it looked, to outside observers, like an accident of temperament rather than a pattern of intent. From opportunities that should have been Claire's, the summer Edmund offered to take a grandchild to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, an invitation Margaret intercepted before Claire ever saw it, showing up instead in a custom-tailored navy blazer and spending the afternoon charming senior partners while Claire sat at home believing the trip had been canceled due to a conflict in Edmund's schedule. When they were in their early 20s and Edmund was looking for a summer intern at Harrington Capital, Margaret had submitted Claire's application to the firm's HR system using a slightly incorrect email address, one transposed letter, the kind of thing that looks like a typo. So the confirmation bounced and Claire's application went into a void while Margaret submitted her own with a handwritten note on cream stationery that Edmund kept in his desk drawer for years, because it was well written and because he was the kind of man who held on to things that told him something true about the person who made them. What he held on to was evidence. He just hadn't finished examining it yet. Edmund Harrington Sr. was not a man who missed things. He had spent 50 years in markets, which meant he had spent 50 years in rooms full of people who were trying to appear to be something other than what they were, and he had developed over those 50 years an almost clinical ability to tell the difference between the performance of a thing and the actual presence of it. He watched his granddaughters. He watched them the way he watched a quarterly earnings report, steadily, without preconception, looking for the number that didn't reconcile. It was around 2010, Edmund told Patricia Osei later, that the number stopped reconciling. Margaret had arrived at his Upper East Side townhouse for Sunday dinner 45 minutes late in a chauffeured Escalade, carrying a Hermes Birkin in a shade of orange that cost roughly what his first office lease had cost per month, talking loudly on her phone about a Hamptons house share she was arranging with the Vanderbilt cousins. She had kissed Edmund on the cheek without breaking the call. She had sat down at the dinner table and spent the first 20 minutes conducting business on her phone under the tablecloth in a way she clearly believed was invisible. Claire had arrived on the subway, in a wool peacoat she had owned since graduate school. She had come in through the kitchen because she always came in through the kitchen, and she had spent the first 20 minutes of her arrival helping Rosa, Edmund's housekeeper, carry the dishes from the kitchen to the dining room, because Rosa's arthritis was worsening and the heavy serving platters were difficult for her, and Claire had noticed this approximately 6 months earlier and had simply, without making an announcement about it, started helping. Edmund had watched all of this from the doorway of the dining room, his bourbon untouched in his hand. He had watched Margaret's performance in Claire's presence, and he had done the math that he was always, in everything, doing. And the math had given him an answer he had not expected but was not, in retrospect, surprised by. He had been watching the wrong granddaughter. He began calling Claire on Thursday evenings. Not about the business at first, about books. About the Federal Reserve. About a Senate Banking Committee hearing that had happened that week, and what it might mean for commercial real estate lending over the next 18 months if you followed the logical chain carefully enough. And Claire, who had a Wharton MBA that no one in the family ever mentioned because Margaret also had a Wharton MBA and Margaret's was louder, Claire could follow the logical chain. She could follow it 2 steps further than Edmund took it and then hand it back to him with a question that made him set down his bourbon and sit forward in his library chair and say, "Now that is the right question." He began to include her. Quietly, without announcement, the way he did everything that actually mattered. He invited her to observe board meetings as his personal guest. He connected her through careful back channels with Patricia Osei, Harrington Capital's senior managing director, a woman who had run the firm's alternative investments division for 19 years and who had the specific hard-won intelligence of someone who has spent 2 decades in rooms full of people performing competence, which is to say she could identify the real thing from approximately 20 feet away. Osei met Claire at a board observation session in the spring of 2020. She watched her for 3 hours, the way Claire listened, the way she took notes, the specific questions she asked afterward when Edmund introduced them over coffee in his office. She called Edmund that evening and said, "I understand what you're doing." Edmund said, "Good." Osei said, "I'm in." And that was that. For the next 3 years, Edmund built the architecture of his succession with the same patient, structural precision he had applied to every significant decision of his professional life. He consulted with Osei on Claire's development. He connected Claire with key relationships in the firm. He documented everything, their conversations, her growth, her demonstrated understanding of the firm's portfolio and philosophy, and the relationships that held it together. And he retained a separate estate attorney, Gerald Fitch of Fitch, Rourke and Associates, who had no social connection to the Harrington family circle, and who specialized in airtight estate planning for precisely the kind of high net worth situation where family dynamics made contested wills a likely outcome. Edmund updated his will in 2019, then again in 2021, a final revision in September 2023, 3 weeks before his first major stroke, after 3 independent physicians had evaluated his cognitive capacity and signed off on his testamentary competence with the kind of clinical thoroughness that suggested someone had anticipated the need to make this documentation bulletproof. Because someone had. He told no one. Not Richard, who was in Palm Beach on an allowance Edmund had quietly reduced twice in the preceding decade, still charming, still irresponsible, his hair gone silver now, his golf game excellent, his self-awareness essentially unchanged. Not Diana, who had remarried a Connecticut developer and had not spoken to Edmund since 2012. Not Margaret, who called him every birthday and every Christmas with the regularity and warmth of a subscription service. And not Claire, because Edmund understood something about the gift he was giving her that went beyond money or shares or real estate or a corner office on the 42nd floor of a midtown building. He was giving her the moment. The specific, public, undeniable, irrevocable moment when the world would be required to see her. He died on a Wednesday morning in early October, peacefully in his own bed, in the 157 penthouse that had been his home for 11 years, with the Manhattan skyline filling the south-facing windows in the particular clear light way it does in early autumn, all clean lines and pale blue sky and the distant glitter of the Hudson. Claire was beside him because Claire had been there for 3 days. Because Rosa had called on Sunday evening and said Mr. Edmund wasn't well, and Claire had put down whatever she was doing and driven up from Brooklyn and had been reading to him and making sure he ate and sitting in the chair beside his bed every evening until he slept. And on Wednesday morning when his breathing changed she had taken his hand in both of hers and held it, and not said a word, and Edmund James Harrington Sr. had. died in the presence of someone who loved him not for what he was worth but for who he had been, which was a complicated man and a demanding man and a sometimes difficult man, but also a fair man, and a man who had, in the end, looked at the people around him with clear eyes and made an honest accounting of what he saw, and done what the accounting required. Margaret arrived 4 hours later. She came in the chauffeured Escalade in a black Chanel suit that she had clearly changed into before leaving her apartment, because it was too put together for someone who had just received unexpected news. She walked through the penthouse with the specific focused energy of someone conducting an inventory. She touched the Basquiat in the library. She asked, within earshot of Edmund's personal assistant, whether the will had already been sent to the attorneys. She did not ask how he had died. She did not ask Rosa, who had been in that apartment for 22 years and was sitting at the kitchen table with red eyes and her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, whether she was all right. She went to the library, poured herself 2 fingers of Edmund's Pappy Van Winkle from the bottle that had been sitting untouched beside his chair for 3 days, and made 3 phone calls. The funeral was the following Friday at St. James Episcopal Church on Madison Avenue, a church with which the Harrington family had maintained a relationship since 1976, and in which Edmund's funeral therefore occupied a particular social register: dark suits, white lilies, the scent of formal grief and old money, a string quartet from Juilliard playing the Bach he had requested in a handwritten note left with his personal assistant months before. 230 people attended. The mayor's office sent a representative. Several senior figures from the New York financial community occupied pews in the first 3 rows. Margaret had taken control of the arrangements within 72 hours of Edmund's death with the swift, total efficiency of someone who had been mentally planning this moment for years. She coordinated the flowers, the program, the catering for the reception. She placed herself in the front pew as the primary family representative and delivered the eulogy. 12 minutes, no notes, emotionally precise, and structured in a way that put Margaret at the center of nearly every significant memory she chose to share. Their day at the stock exchange. Their conversations about the market. His pride in her education. His belief in her potential. She delivered it with the flawless, practiced grief of a woman who had been performing for audiences her entire life. And the audience, which did not know the whole story, received it as intended. Claire sat in the second pew. She wore her grandmother's pearls and a dark gray dress she had owned for several years, and she listened to her sister give her grandfather's eulogy and said nothing, and her expression was unreadable in the way that very still water is unreadable. You look at it and you see the surface and you cannot tell how deep it goes. Afterward, in the receiving line on the Madison Avenue sidewalk, with October making the air sharp and the last of the park's leaves spiraling down in the wind, Margaret moved through the line with a glass of water in one hand and a performance of elegant grief in the other. She spoke to the mayor's representative. She embraced the CEO of a private equity firm that had been a Harrington competitor for 30 years. She accepted condolences with the specific gracious restraint of a woman who is also announcing herself. And then she reached Claire, who was standing at the edge of the receiving line near the casket spray of white peonies, and she leaned in close, under the sound of the street and the murmur of 230 people, and she said it. "You were always his charity case, sweetie." Her voice was perfectly modulated, warm on the surface and completely empty underneath. "The will is mine. All of it. I hope you've been saving." She smiled. It was a beautiful smile. She had a beautiful smile. Claire looked at her for a long moment. A cab horn sounded on Madison. The wind moved. Claire said nothing. She said nothing because Gerald Fitch had called her cell phone 48 hours earlier, on a Monday evening, while she was driving back from Edmund's apartment after helping Rosa begin the process of notifying the building staff. His voice had been professional and measured and entirely without drama. He had introduced himself as the sole attorney of record for the estate of Edmund James Harrington Sr., and had asked whether she would be available for a reading of the will on Tuesday, October the 14th, at 9 o'clock in the morning, at his offices on Broad Street in the financial district. He had not called Margaret. Claire had said yes. She had driven the rest of the way to Brooklyn in the quiet of a Monday night Manhattan, the bridge lights making their usual geometry above the dark water, and she had gone home and made herself green tea and sat at the kitchen table where she had done her Wharton coursework 12 years earlier, and thought about her grandfather, and the Thursday phone calls, and the pearls, and the note he had written in the front of the leather notebook he gave her for Christmas 3 years ago, for the things worth writing down. And she had understood, with a completeness that arrived not like a revelation but like a thing she had already known that was now confirmed, what had happened. She had not slept much, but she had been at work by 7 the next morning. Gerald Fitch's offices occupied the 14th floor of a building on Broad Street 12 blocks from the New York Stock Exchange. They were working offices, dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves packed with the specific dense legal volumes that no one reads but everyone owns, the institutional smell of paper and professional discretion that accumulates in spaces where people come to settle the accounts of a life. Fitch himself was a compact man in his late 60s, wire-rimmed glasses, a charcoal suit of expensive but deliberately understated cut, the unhurried confidence of a man who has never in his professional life needed to raise his voice. Margaret had insisted on attending. When Claire mentioned the appointment, neutrally, at the post-funeral reception in Edmund's penthouse, over the salmon canapes and the floral arrangements and the soft undertone of 200 people conducting the social business of grief, Margaret had set down her champagne glass and said, with impressive composure, "Of course. I'll be there." She had called her attorney that evening, a senior litigator at Braddock and Hale named Charles Whitmore, who arrived the following morning in a charcoal overcoat that communicated, without stating, that he had done this before and expected to prevail. They met in the elevator on the 14th floor, the two sisters and Charles Whitmore, in the morning of it, and the physical arrangement of them said something wordlessly true. Margaret at the center of the elevator, Whitmore at her right shoulder like a formal escort, and Claire one step to the left, in her grandmother's pearls and the gray wool dress, carrying a small leather notebook. Fitch greeted them in the conference room, offered water, and took his seat at the head of the table with the particular composed gravity of a man who knows exactly what he is about to do and has prepared for every response to it. He waited while they settled, Margaret and Whitmore on one side of the long walnut table, Claire across from them. And then he opened the manila folder and removed the document. "Before I read," he said, and his voice was even and careful, "I want to note for the record that this instrument was executed in full compliance with New York estate law on September 14, 2023, in the presence of 3 witnesses and a licensed notary, and has been reviewed by this office comprehensively for contestability on any available grounds." He paused. "Mr. Harrington was thorough. I want to note that as well." He began to read. The opening bequests were detailed and took time. A significant charitable gift to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an endowment to a Pittsburgh steelworkers' education fund that Edmund had maintained quietly and without publicity since 1989, a bequest to Rosa, his housekeeper, of a sum that would, when she was separately notified, reduce her to tears at her kitchen table in the Bronx apartment she had shared with her daughter for 19 years. 3 endowments to long-tenured Harrington Capital employees that would change the financial trajectories of their families for a generation. Each of these was read in its entirety. It took 11 minutes. Charles Whitmore was taking notes. Margaret's hands were folded on the table. Her expression was composed, confident, attentive. The expression of a woman who is waiting for her name, who has been waiting her entire life for her name. Gerald Fitch turned the page. "The residual estate of Edmund James Harrington Sr.," he read, and his voice did not change at all, did not lift or lower or shift in any way to signal what was coming, "including all financial instruments, cash and cash equivalents, real property holdings, and controlling interest in Harrington Capital Group LLC, representing a net estimated value of $342 million as of the date of this instrument, is bequeathed in its entirety to my granddaughter, Claire Diana Harrington of Brooklyn, New York." The room did what rooms do in the moments that actually matter. It went completely, absolutely, perfectly silent. Whitmore's pen stopped. It had been moving steadily across his notepad, the practiced, automatic movement of an attorney taking notes, and it stopped mid-stroke. Margaret's hands, which had been resting folded on the table, went very still. Fitch continued reading, because there was more. "I further designate Claire Diana Harrington as the executor of this estate in its entirety, and as the incoming Chief Executive Officer of Harrington Capital Group, a role for which she has been systematically prepared, in full consultation with Patricia Osei, managing director, over the preceding 4 years. It is my wish and my specific instruction that this transition occur within 60 days of the date of my death, and that the board of Harrington Capital Group, which has been separately and formally notified of this provision by letter dated September 15, 2023, confirm her appointment at its next scheduled meeting. He turned another page. His voice remained perfectly even. I wish to note additionally that I am aware my granddaughter Margaret Louise Harrington may find this distribution unexpected. I want to be explicit that this decision is not punitive in its intent. It is rather a recognition of character, of demonstrated stewardship, of the specific kind of devotion that presents itself not when it is convenient or visible or likely to be rewarded, but when it costs something. Claire showed up. She showed up when it was inconvenient. She showed up when no one was watching. She showed up when it was hard. I watched. I am grateful beyond my ability to express it. And I trust her, without reservation, with everything I spent my life building. Fitch closed the folder. He placed his hands flat on the table and looked at both of them. I'll give you a moment, he said. He looked at Claire directly, for the first time since they had sat down, and what was in his expression was not quite a smile, but was 1 degree removed from it. Miss Harrington, he said. Congratulations. He stood. He walked out of the conference room and closed the door behind him. The silence that followed had a texture and a temperature. Whitmore was leaning toward Margaret almost immediately, his voice low and fast, professional crisis management assembling itself in real time. Undue influence, cognitive capacity, the timeline of the 2023 revision, alternative grounds, the cost-benefit of a preliminary injunction against estate distribution. Margaret was not hearing him. She was looking at Claire, and Claire was looking at her. Steady, still, her hands in her lap, her grandmother's pearls at her throat, the leather notebook on the table in front of her. Something moved across Margaret's face. Something that was not quite any of the things Claire might have expected. Not rage, not contempt, not the polished performance of injured dignity that Margaret had spent a lifetime deploying. Something rawer. The specific and difficult expression of a person who has just had the premise of their entire self-conception publicly and irrevocably revised. It lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then it was replaced by rage. This is a mistake, Margaret said. Her voice was controlled. Every word was controlled. His cognitive state in 2023 was compromised. He had 2 strokes. The strokes were in 2024 and 2025, Claire said. Her voice was quiet and level, the voice of someone who is not performing calm but is simply, actually calm. The will was executed in September 2023. 3 independent physicians evaluated him prior to the signing. Gerald has their reports. All 3 cleared him at the highest level of testamentary capacity. You influenced him. I read him the journal on Sundays, Claire said. I sat with him on Thursday evenings. I was there when he was sick. That is not influence. That is presence. She paused. A single beat. He noticed the difference. Margaret stood. Her chair scraped back against the hardwood floor with the sound of something ending. This is not over, she said. I know, Claire said. I've been prepared for that too. What Margaret did not know, could not know, because Claire had operated over the preceding 48 hours with the same patient. Structural silence that Edmund had spent 12 years teaching her, was the extent of what had already been built. Claire had called Patricia Osei on Monday evening, 40 minutes after Gerald Fitch's call. Osei had been waiting. Literally waiting. Edmund had told her, in their final conversation before his stroke changed everything, that when the time came, Claire's call would be the first thing to happen, and Osei was to receive it and act immediately. She'll be ready, Edmund had said. Make sure the firm is ready for her. They met for breakfast the morning after the funeral at a corner table at the Lowell on East 63rd Street. Osei was in her charcoal pantsuit, silver-haired, direct, completely unhurried. She had ordered black coffee and had a folder on the table beside her cup that she opened without preamble. The board knows, Osei said. Not everything. Edmund told them enough 6 months ago that 3 of the 5 members are already prepared to confirm your appointment. The other 2 are Howard Griggs and Paul Sutherland. Griggs has a personal relationship with Margaret that goes back 15 years. Sutherland is cautious by disposition. He'll watch which way the wind blows and position accordingly. I have a plan for both. She looked up from the folder. Margaret will contest the will. Her attorney, Whitmore from Braddock and Hale, is aggressive and he is well connected, and he is also working from a case that has no foundation, which he either already knows or will know shortly. The documentation Edmund assembled is comprehensive enough that any challenge will be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful. I'd estimate 6 to 8 weeks to clear preliminary probate even without active opposition. During that period, the board has authority to appoint an interim CEO. She paused just slightly. I am moving that they appoint you. The board meeting is in 3 weeks. I'm scheduling it for a Thursday. Claire looked at her across the table. She asked the question she had learned from years of careful watching to always ask. Why are you doing this? Osei was quiet for a moment. Outside, 63rd Street was doing its morning thing. The first shift cabs, the dog walkers, the particular early autumn light of the Upper East Side. Because I've been at that firm for 19 years, she said finally. And I've watched Edmund build something extraordinary, and I've spent those 19 years watching the people around him see the money and miss the firm. And I've spent 9 months watching you, and I think she stopped. Something shifted in her expression. Something that looked like relief, the specific relief of a person who has been holding a breath for a very long time. I think Edmund was right. I think you're the one he should have been building toward from the beginning. I think he knew that. She picked up her coffee. Better late than never. Claire retained Dana Reeves that same afternoon. Reeves was 44 from Cleveland, the lead partner of a boutique estate litigation firm on Park Avenue South that had defended 4 contested wills against major firm challenges in the past decade, and had won all 4. She reviewed Edmund's estate documents for 3 hours and called Claire at 9 in the evening. They have no case, she said. The cognitive evaluations are clean. The paper trail of your involvement with the firm is in the public record and goes back 4 years. The 3-year documentation of your personal relationship with Edmund is extensive enough that any undue influence claim would be laughed out of a preliminary hearing. And the separate board notification letter is genuinely brilliant on Edmund's part. It legally decouples the firm's leadership transition from the estate contest, meaning Margaret can file all the motions she wants, and it will not slow your appointment as CEO by a single day. She paused. Your sister is going to spend a significant amount of money on attorney fees pursuing this. I'd allow it. It is likely to be the last consequential financial decision she makes for some time. The estate documents went into probate the next morning. Formal notifications went to Richard, Diana, and Margaret by registered mail from Fitch's office. A 4-page letter from Dana Reeves went to Charles Whitmore at Braddock and Hale detailing, with thorough professional courtesy, the precise legal reasons why every available ground for contest was insufficient, the estimated combined legal expenditure if they chose to proceed regardless, and a note regarding Harrington Capital's D&O insurance coverage, which had been reviewed in advance for applicability to bad faith estate litigation, and found not to apply. Whitmore received the letter on Thursday morning. He called Margaret on Thursday afternoon. The call lasted 45 minutes. Margaret spent most of it saying things like, there has to be something, and the board relationship with Griggs, and Edmund would never have done this without being manipulated. Whitmore spent most of it providing the professional service that clients in Margaret's position most need and least want, which is honesty. They filed anyway. Margaret filed a formal challenge to the will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished testamentary capacity. The challenge was 40 pages long, cost her $230,000 to prepare, and was dismissed at the preliminary hearing level before it reached a judge. The dismissal ruling cited, among other things, the quality and comprehensiveness of the cognitive evaluation documentation as among the most thorough this court has reviewed in an estate matter of this nature. Margaret filed an appeal. The appeal was dismissed. Legal fees by this point were approaching $460,000, a number that, for a woman who had spent 38 years financially planning around an inheritance that no longer existed, was not abstract. Meanwhile, Claire was working. The Harrington Capital Board meeting happened on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the funeral, in the firm's conference room on the 42nd floor with the floor-to-ceiling southward windows and the walnut table that had been in that room since 1994. Patricia O'Sea had prepared for it with the thoroughness of a military campaign. 3 of the 5 board members arrived already aligned. Paul Sutherland had been sent the evening before, an analysis of the firm's Q3 performance that Claire had prepared. 12 pages, precise, specific, demonstrating a depth of understanding of the portfolio that left him, when he finished reading it at 10 o'clock Thursday night in his library on the Upper East Side, sitting with the pages in his lap thinking, she already knows the firm better than 2 of the people who currently run it. Howard Griggs arrived with his objections assembled and Margaret's voice in his ear from the previous evening's phone call. He made his motion, delay the appointment, allow the estate matter to resolve, act in the firm's interests, and O'Sea let him finish, and then she distributed the packet. Edmund's 3-year documentation of Claire's preparation, the letters of support from 3 of the firm's senior managing directors, the cognitive evaluations, and the 1-page handwritten statement from Edmund, notarized, addressed to the board that said, I have spent 3 years preparing Claire to lead this firm. She is ready. Do not make her wait. The firm cannot afford to wait. Griggs read it twice. He looked up. He looked at Claire, who was seated at the foot of the table in a charcoal blazer and her grandmother's pearls, her copy of the Q3 earnings report open in front of her, annotated in her precise, small handwriting. She met his eyes. She did not perform. She simply waited. The vote was 4-1 for her appointment as interim CEO. Howard Griggs did not vote against her. He abstained. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then at his hands, and something in what he found there was apparently sufficient, because he said abstain when his name was called and then did not speak again for the rest of the meeting. Claire thanked the board. She exchanged a look with Patricia O'Sea across the walnut table that contained, in approximately half a second, an entire conversation. And then she asked for the Q3 numbers to be put on the conference room screen, because she had questions about the alternative investments exposure in the 3rd tranche and she wanted to work through them before the market opened. The Wall Street Journal profile ran 6 weeks later. It was 1,200 words in the weekend magazine, with a photograph of Claire at her desk in the Harrington Capital offices. No jewelry, no styling, just a woman at work, and a headline that read, The Quiet Harrington. The piece traced her background, her preparation, her relationship with Edmund, and her first weeks as CEO with a specificity that was only possible because the reporter had been given, through Gerald Fitch's office, access to the documentation Edmund had assembled over 3 years. The piece did not mention Margaret by name. It did not need to. Margaret read it on a Saturday morning at the kitchen counter of her Upper West Side apartment, which she owned and in which she was now living on the actual finances of her actual life rather than the projected finances of an anticipated inheritance, and the difference between those 2 things was significant. She read the piece the way you read something you are hoping will contain an error. She found none. The Harrington Capital Annual Investor Dinner was held in November at the pool in the Seagram Building. Mies van der Rohe's 40-foot windows, the formal grandeur of establishment New York, a room that understood the weight of things. 240 attendees. Limited partners, board members, senior staff, institutional investors, the heads of 2 sovereign wealth funds, the financial press. It was the most significant event the firm had staged in a decade. Margaret was not invited. This was not engineered as a punishment. Claire had constructed the guest list around the question of who belonged in the room for the purposes of this evening, and Margaret, who had no professional relationship with the firm, no role in its management, and no standing with its clients, simply did not belong. It was the most honest thing Claire had done to her in 38 years. Claire spoke for 30 minutes without notes. She was not dazzling. She was not performing. She talked about Edmund's philosophy of stewardship over speculation, about compound patience as an investment strategy, and as a management philosophy, about the specific vision she had for Harrington Capital's next decade. She answered questions for an hour afterward with the unhurried precision of someone who has been thinking about these things carefully for a long time, and is simply now saying them out loud. 3 LPs who had been nervous about the transition left that evening having increased their commitments for the following year. Patricia O'Sea watched from the head table and looked, for the first time since Edmund's death, like a woman who has set down something heavy. Bloomberg Markets ran a piece 10 days later assessing the leadership transition as unexpectedly smooth, noting the LP commitment increases and quoting one senior limited partner, anonymously, as saying that Edmund had clearly spent his last years not just managing the firm but choosing its future. The quote used the phrase choosing correctly. Margaret's legal challenge collapsed entirely by December. The appeal dismissal was final. Her total legal expenditure was $462,000. She had a consulting arrangement with a boutique real estate advisory firm on the East Side and 2 nonprofit board seats, neither of which paid significantly, and the financial reality of the life she had actually built, as opposed to the life she had been waiting to inherit, was now fully, starkly visible to her for the first time. She called Claire on a Sunday in January. Claire was in the office, which she almost always was on weekends now, not from obligation but because the work was genuinely where she wanted to be, which was something Edmund had told her once was the best possible sign that you were in the right place. The call came to her cell phone and she looked at the name on the screen for a long moment and then she answered. "Margaret," she said. "I want to talk," Margaret said. Her voice was different. Not stripped of performance entirely. It had been too long a habit, but reduced. Quieter. The performance turned down to something closer to human scale. "Okay," Claire said. "I didn't know he was watching," Margaret said. "I mean, I knew he watched everything. That was always who he was. But I didn't." She stopped. The silence on the line was a working silence, the silence of someone choosing carefully what to actually say. "I didn't know he was watching that." "He watched all of it," Claire said. "For a very long time. He was patient." "He was always patient," Margaret said. Silence again. Claire was standing at the window of her office. 52 floors below, Midtown was doing its Sunday thing. Lighter traffic, fewer cabs. The particular muted version of Manhattan that appears on winter weekend afternoons. All pale light and cold sky and the distant silver of the Hudson. She waited because she had learned that waiting was not weakness. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," Margaret said. "I want you to know that." "I know," Claire said. A long pause. And then quietly with a plainness that cost something. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth after all of this. I'm sorry." It was not comprehensive. It did not catalog 38 years of small cruelties and intercepted opportunities in photographs taken at angles that left one sister slightly out of frame. It was 3 words from a woman who had spent her entire adult life as a person who did not say them, to the person to whom they were most owed. Claire was quiet. "I know," she said. And then, "Take care of yourself, Margaret." She hung up the phone. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at the city, looking at the pale winter sky above it. She thought about Edmund in this building, in this office for 50 years. She thought about what it takes to build something that outlasts you. She thought about the Thursday phone calls and the pearls and the morning in the library when he had handed her the annotated copy of Benjamin Graham's security analysis. His own copy, the one he had used when he was building the firm, with his margin notes from 1974 and 1981 and 1994 in 3 different inks, without explanation, simply handing it to her, because he had decided she was the one who should have it next. She thought about what it means to be seen by someone who knew how to look. Richard Harrington in Palm Beach had received the news of the will with a long silence over the phone and then said to his attorney, "I'm not surprised. I should have been paying more attention." He had not contested anything. He was on the golf course by noon the next day, his bourbon on the porch that evening, his life unchanged in its essential architecture and therefore perhaps not unlike what he deserved. Diana had called once briefly to say she thought Edmund had been difficult and that the whole thing was very sad, and then she had not called again. Howard Griggs resigned from the Harrington Capital Board in February, citing a desire to reduce commitments. Claire accepted his resignation with a gracious note and appointed in his place a woman named Simone Park who had run the infrastructure division at a competing firm for 12 years and who, in her first board meeting, asked the most interesting question Claire had heard in 6 months of board meetings. Patricia Osei remained. She remained at the head of alternative investments, she remained at the head table at every significant firm event, and she remained the person Claire called on Thursday evenings when she needed to think out loud, which was not, in the end, so different from what Edmund had needed, and which suggested that the pattern of those phone calls had been all along about something larger than the 2 people who made them. The Pittsburgh Steelworkers Education Fund that Edmund had maintained since 1989 received its annual contribution in January, as it always had. The amount under Claire's first year of management was 50% larger than the previous year. No announcement was made. No press release was issued. This was, she had decided, how Edmund had always done it, and she saw no reason to do it differently. Rosa retired in the spring. She had been offered the endowment in Edmund's will, which was enough for her to stop working entirely and move into a larger apartment near her daughter and grandchildren in the Bronx. On her last day, she called Claire to say goodbye, and Claire picked up on the first ring, and they talked for 45 minutes about Edmund, about the Sunday dinners, about the way he had always left the kitchen light on when he knew Rosa would be arriving early, and about the morning he died, and about the pearls. At the end of the call, Rosa said, "He was so proud of you. He just didn't say it where you could hear it." And Claire said, "I know. That was very him." And they laughed together, the kind of laugh that comes from grief that has had enough time to find, somewhere inside itself, something else as well. Edmund James Harrington Sr. had built $342 million in a firm and a legacy, and he had spent his last years making absolutely certain that all of it would go to the right person. He had been patient about it, methodical, thorough. All the things he had always been, applied now to the final and most important task of his professional and personal life, which was not the accumulation of the thing but the proper disposition of it. He had watched. He had been grateful. He had trusted. And in the 52nd floor office where he had worked for 30 years, on a Sunday evening in January, in the clear cold light of a New York winter, his granddaughter was at her desk with his annotated security analysis open beside her laptop and the leather notebook he had given her, for the things worth writing down, open to a fresh page, and she was writing, and she was at work, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The building was quiet. The city was not, because the city is never quiet, and Edmund had always loved that about it. Its refusal to settle, its permanent forward motion, its faith in its own improbable, expensive, magnificent continuity. Outside the 52nd floor windows, Manhattan went on. Below and to the south, the lights of the financial district were coming on in the early winter dark, one building at a time, the way they always had, the way they would continue to long after everyone in this story was gone. Steady and indifferent and beautiful, the way that cities are beautiful, which is without nostalgia and without mercy and without any particular interest in whether you deserve it. Claire Harrington worked until 8 o'clock. Then she put on her coat, picked up her bag and her notebook and the worn, beloved, margin-noted security analysis, and she took the elevator down 52 floors to the lobby, and she walked out into the Manhattan night, and she turned toward home. She had always turned toward home. That had always been the thing about her, the thing Margaret had never understood, the thing that Edmund had understood completely and had staked everything on. She always, in the end, turned toward the thing that was real. It had cost her for a long time, and then it had given her everything. That is the story of Claire Harrington. That is the story of Edmund and of what it means to watch carefully and to wait and to really see the person standing in the corner reading. The executor called her name. And everything that followed was exactly what should have happened all along.